may be a bit misleading if you're expecting a civic pageant with our panelists reenacting scenes from the history of Osawatomie, Kansas. I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. I tried to talk them into it, and it was just a no-go. But that town in eastern Kansas certainly does have a storied past. Just a little over 100 years ago, on August 31st, 1910, former President Theodore Roosevelt mounted a kitchen table on the grounds of the 22-acre state park he was helping to dedicate in Osawatomie, John Brown State Park, and delivered what has gone down in history as his New Nationalism speech. It certainly wouldn't have gone down in history as his John Brown speech, since the fiery abolitionist who had battled pro-slavery raiders on that spot in the days of bloody Kansas snagged only 2 cursory mentions in TR's speech. Much to the relief of his advisors, I should add, who knew that TR was one of those politicians who also regarded himself as something of an historian, although the corporations of his day weren't about to pay him for his historical advice. The New Nationalism speech would be described by one of TR's many biographers, George Mowry, as, quote, the most radical speech ever given by an ex-president. His concepts of the extent to which a powerful federal government could regulate and use private property in the interest of the whole, and his declarations about labor, when viewed with the eyes of 1910, were nothing short of revolutionary. On December 6, 2011, President Barack Obama returned to Osawatomie, and standing on a platform somewhat more secure than a kitchen table, explicitly embraced the underlying philosophy of TR's New Nationalism. Why a Democrat, a member of a party which customarily recurs to the other Roosevelt, especially in hard times, should in this instance have embraced the Republican Roosevelt, will no doubt be explored today among many other issues in this discussion we're about to hear. And we have a terrific panel for that discussion, composed of prominent political analysts who know a great deal about both the progressive era as well as contemporary politics. I'll introduce first my co-moderator for the day, E.J. Dionne, Washington Post columnist, who will make later some introductory remarks and then comment on the presentations after they've been made. Then we'll hear from a couple of University of Virginia professors. Sid Milkis, author of a wonderful book on progressive politics entitled Theodore Roosevelt, the Progressive Party, and the Transformation of American Democracy, and Jim Caesar, professor of politics at UVA. Next, we'll hear from John Halpin, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and finally, Matt Spalding, vice president for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation. So, EJ.
Yeah, first, it's great to see so many people here. Happy holidays, and to those who celebrate them, Merry Christmas and Happy Hanukkah. I want to thank my friend Bill Shambra for putting together what is a genuinely fair and balanced event, which doesn't always happen in Washington. Bill and I have been agreeing for about a quarter century on the importance of community and disagreeing about what progressives make of the idea of community for about that long. And it's just great to be with him. And I just want to say something about each of the panelists. Sid Milkis's book on the 1912 election, absolutely everyone should read. On the way over here, I was remembering this series of books. Some of you may be old enough to remember them. They were history books for kids called Landmark books that I think Random House put together. And for some reason, a blurb on the back always stayed in my head. Anyone who has not feasted upon them has been cheated. Well, anyone who has not feasted upon Sid's book about the 1912 election has been cheated. And so you will, when you hear what he has to say, you'll know why you must go out and buy it. Jim Caesar is absolutely brilliant, and I find myself disagreeing with Jim, but it is highly risky because he's so damn smart. Forgive the damn on C-SPAN. And yet I try to live dangerously, but it's a real honor to be with Sid. John Halpin has done exceptional work at CAP. Liberals, not surprisingly, are not nearly as good as conservatives are in remembering, honoring, and thinking about their own tradition. I think by their very nature, conservatives are more inclined to think of what a tradition means. What John has done at CAP on progressivism, I think, is truly important, and I want to salute him and also his colleague Rui to share. And finally, Matt Spalding and I have also had a running argument for many years over the social gospel movement back in the turn of the century. So I feel, and he has done some great work on that, even though we don't always agree. And so what you have here are a whole lot of people obsessed with America in 1912, and we will try to show how that is entirely related to America in 2012. It is the centennial of that great election, and this election may be as important as that one was. And so I just want to thank everyone, and they know what the order is. I think Sid is going to start.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming, Bill. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. God bless you for shouting out about my book. A feast, that might be a little hyperbole, but I'll take the compliment. I was not surprised, I have to say, to see President Obama channeling Theodore Roosevelt in Osawatomie, Kansas. In the last chapter of my book, which was published in 2009 on TR's Progressive Party Crusade, which began with the New Nationalism speech, I suggested that the election of America's first African-American president revealed that the principles and practices championed by the Bull Moose campaign, as TR famously called it, had become a powerful and enduring force in American life. I went so far as to claim that Obama and his campaign marked the apotheosis of progressive democracy. Now, I have to confess, I wasn't quite sure what I meant by that, but it sort of sounded right. It seemed that after 3 decades dominated by the strains of Ronald Reagan's refrain, the government was no longer the solution, but now the problem, Obama brought back into full relief the promise and the peril of a powerful strain of progressivism launched by TR in Kansas. Like TR, Obama identified with Lincoln's measured but radical pursuit of emancipation. Like TR2, Obama presented himself as a transcendent leader, as Roosevelt famously put it in Osawatomie, as the steward of the public welfare, who could rise above polarizing economic conflict of his time, who could rise above special interests to serve the interests of the whole people. And just as TR sought to navigate a purposeful third way between socialism and capitalism, so Obama promised to be a post-partisan leader who would heal the rancorous Democratic and Republican struggles over the welfare and national security states. Of course, many of the audacious hopes of Obama's campaign have been bitterly disappointed during his first term. The attacks from the left have hardly been less condemning than those from the right. He has often seemed to be a hollowed out form. He has embodied a sort of hollowed out form of progressivism oftentimes, revealing the soulless pragmatism that Randolph Bourne criticized in his brilliant essay, Twilight of the Idols, published in 1917. Bourne warned that progressives celebrated an executive-centered administrative state that exalted means over ends, that sought to subordinate the truth of first principles, the truth of the Declaration, indeed all doctrine and partisan dispute, to democratic experimentation, as FDR would later put it, to bold, persistent experimentation. Disappointed with their support of Wilson's war to make the world safe for democracy, a vague nostrum, Bourne argued, that did not live up to its promise abroad and was badly betrayed at home. Bourne attacked intellectuals like John Dewey and Herbert Croly, who was the godfather, the intellectual godfather of New Nationalism. And he attacked them as being immersed in what he called pragmatic dispensation that made them, he said, immensely ready for the executive order of events, but pitifully unprepared for the intellectual interpretation or idealistic focus on end. Now, had he been around in 2009, Bourne might have lodged a similar criticism against President Obama's dogged but rhetorically empty leadership in the fight over national health reform, a battle he rightfully pointed out began with the Progressive Party campaign. He tended, in his fight for health care reform, the president tended to eschew exalted moral principles. For example, the claim of TR that health care was a human right, not a privilege, for dubious promises of greater efficiency and cost cutting. The highest rhetorical and programmatic aspiration of the healthcare fight was the public option. You couldn't come up with a worse term, it seems to me. My colleague Jacob Hacker came up with that term. It testifies, I think, to contemporary progressives' rhetorical challenge. Can you imagine Caesar and I calling the University of Virginia the public option? That's sort of what that sort of had reveals the problem. Although a serious, and I think in some respects, very impressive effort to revive the high moral calling of progressive democracy, Obama's Osawatomie speech also reflects the twilight of reform in some ways that Bourne feared. The most effective parts of the address drew parallels to Roosevelt's claim that massive disruptions in society and economy, the unleashing of powerful commercial forces embodied by giant corporations, required that the national government, Roosevelt had the audacity to call it the national state, had new responsibilities to protect equality of opportunity. Roosevelt believed, Obama observed, that the free market is the greatest force for economic progress in human history. It led to a prosperity and a standard of living unmatched by the rest of the world. But Roosevelt also knew, he continued, that the free market has never been a free license to take whatever you can from whomever you can. Our country, he quoted from TR's address, means nothing unless it means the triumph of an economic system under which each man shall be guaranteed the opportunity to show the best that is in him. For this, Obama continued, and if you watch the video, at this point he made a knowing gesture. For this, he said, Roosevelt was called a radical, a socialist, and even a communist. But today, we are a richer nation and a stronger democracy because of what he fought for in his last campaign. And then the president listed Roosevelt's leading proposals that have become an important part of American politics: an 8-hour workday and a minimum wage for women, insurance for the unemployed, the elderly, and those with disabilities, political reform, and a progressive income tax. Like the Republican Roosevelt, and I think intentionally Obama did not invoke FDR, Obama claimed that his reform program aspired to deploy a more effective national government in the service of fair play that is neither socialist or capitalist, that is neither Democratic or Republican, that serves neither the Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street, that served, he summed up, the progressive principles that were now interwoven into the fabric of American life. That's all good stuff, but I'm not sure that Obama's own reform aspirations live up to that billing. They seem somewhat tepid in comparison to TR's new nationalism. He called for an extension of the payroll tax in the short run, and more generally for a fair tax code. And these are important measures to be sure. But he did not offer a strategic vision of bold progressive initiatives for a new political order, as TR did. Nor did he explain how the landmark healthcare and financial reform legislation enacted in 2010, really important pieces of legislation, were the building blocks of a new foundation. The new foundation was a term tried out early in the Obama presidency, but he did not revisit it, strangely, in Osawatomie. It is odd, one of my more sober colleagues said, astonishing, but perhaps telling that the president did not even mention healthcare reform in Kansas. It's particularly odd and astonishing because this is the signature achievement of his first term. This is the holy grail, or it had been the holy grail of progressive democracy since TR's Bull Moose campaign. True to his ruthless pragmatism, as one journalist put it, Obama's address states no high moral purpose. In this sense, it resembles more a rear guard than apotheosis of progressivism. Now, in contrast, Roosevelt Osawatomie utterances were a political call to arms. TR's speech was much more comprehensive, speaking not just to economics, but also to citizenship, conservation, and America's role in the world. Furthermore, whereas Obama's speech avoided what Jim Caesar calls foundational concept, TR framed his call for ambitious reform as all consequential American reformers have, in the fundamental principles of the Declaration, the Constitution, and the connection between them. The 1910 speech was delivered at the dedication, as Bill mentioned, at the John Brown battlefield. TR condemned the violent tactics of Brown's fight in bloody Kansas. He compared that fight to the socialists of his own time. But he acknowledged that that fight was aroused by the country's rank hypocrisy. He said, in name we had the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but we gave the lie by our acts to the words of the Declaration of Independence until 1865, until the enactment of the 13th Amendment. So Roosevelt argued the Industrial Revolution, a crisis no less great than the Civil War, he insisted, required a fundamental realignment of Declaration and Constitution. Indeed, a more fundamental redefinition of the social contract, especially a rethinking of the right to property. As he put it in his speech, his New Nationalism speech, the man who wrongly holds that every human fight is secondary to his profit must now give way to the advocate of human welfare, who rightly maintains that every man holds property subject to the general right of the community, to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it. This subordination of property to human welfare was not just a defense of the welfare state or the regulatory state or an attack on big business. TR's assault on property was joined to progressives' hope for a moral awakening, as he put it, where Americans might be emancipated from their obsession with, he also called it a fetish for, rights, emancipated from an obsession with the slavish pursuit of selfish materialism, and become more committed to a sense of responsibility. He championed things like conservation and the righteous use of force in the world, especially because TR believed these objectives would strengthen the fabric of American society. It would help Americans transcend themselves in a way that would make for a great nation. Righteousness, Roosevelt proclaimed. EJ told me to pound the podium, but I have a sore hand, so I'm not going to do that. But Roosevelt would have. Righteousness, there you go. Righteousness, Roosevelt proclaimed in the final sentence of the longer version of the New Nationalism speech, which was published a few days later in the Outlook, not made a required reading for this thing. In that longer speech, he said, righteousness exalteth the nation. This invocation of proverb in the King James Version of the Bible reveals how progressivism at its founding was infused with the social gospel, a religiosity that, for better and worse, Obama and contemporary progressives usually avoid. Now, let me make one final point that goes back to the beginning of my remarks. Perhaps, as born fear, the hollowing out of progressivism, if I can put it that way, was a logical outcome of its faith in national administration. The fate of this progressive creed, the creed that human rights must take precedence over property rights, was to rest on the shoulders of the steward of the public welfare. That is a really beguiling phrase that I still struggle to understand. Matt suggests that this commitment to a presidency-centered, executive-centered democracy showed a commitment to expertise. But I'm not so sure of that. Knowing that such a modern executive presupposed, as Crowley put it, administrative aggrandizement, a kind of administrative aggrandizement, a kind of statism that Americans had long shunned and feared, TR insisted paradoxically that the new state had to be connected vitally to public opinion. Roosevelt's New Nationalism, his dedication to state building, and this distinguished him from from his counterparts in Western Europe and Great Britain. He believed that state building had to go hand in hand, as he put it in the New Nationalism speech, with more direct action by the people in their own affairs. The direct primary, he said, in Kansas would be a positive step in this direction. And during the 1912 campaign, when he would engage the incumbent president, William Howard Taft, in the first presidential primary campaign, Roosevelt defended a full-throated, pure democracy, as he called it, which included popular referenda on court decisions, an easier method to amend the Constitution, and the opportunity for the people to recall all public officials, including the president. As Bill Schomburg has pointed out, the stand of Taft and Elihu Root for constitutional sobriety, combined with ruthless steamroller machine politics, deprived TR of the Republican nomination, and most likely a third term in the White House, during which he might have enacted his constitutional program. But Roosevelt's third-party crusade for the right of the people to be the ultimate makers of their Constitution, as he put it, aroused considerable enthusiasm. He won nearly 30% of the vote, and it is echoed throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Most of the aspirations that underlay that program have been firmly rooted in custom, an unwritten law that presidents derive their authority directly from the people, directly from public opinion. And I would argue, I'll let Jim make this argument more fully than I would argue that this is a strain of progressivism. This notion that the president must be a steward of the public welfare that embodies the will of the people in programmatic efforts. I would argue that this has been embraced since FDR by Democratic and Republican presidents, by liberals and conservatives. So having said that, let me finish with this. Although the legacy of progressive democracy transcends the ideological battles of the moment in an important way, its pervasiveness raises profound questions. Can an executive-centered administrative state be compatible with an active and competent citizenry? Can the modern presidency, even with the tools of instant communication and social media, function as a truly democratic institution with meaningful links to the public? These were the fundamental questions that troubled the critics of TR's New Nationalism, and they still haunt American democracy. For all the important differences, I'll name these three. This is a prediction. Between President Obama, Newt Gingrich, and Mitt Romney, those are the three I think are still standing. All three are committed, I would say, to presidential leadership in the TR mold. They all champion national administrative power, although for very different objectives. And they all claim that this power must be used in the name of the whole people. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill and EJ, for the kind introduction. Barack Obama's most notable achievement before being elected president was a literary one, authorship of his fine personal memoir, Dreams from My Father, which recounts his agonizing search as a youth for a stable identity, a quest that concludes in his embrace of his absent father's race and his adoption of an African-American persona. Like his effort to secure a firm anchor in his private life, his public career seems to have followed a parallel search for a stable political identity. Recall the launch of his presidential campaign in 2007 in a speech before the old state capitol in Springfield, Illinois. His speech was all about channeling Abraham Lincoln, whom Obama described as a tall, gangly, self-made Springfield lawyer. I think the tall and gangly was a reference to himself. Following his successful 2008 campaign, Obama was likened to, and he never rejected the comparison, he was likened to the greatest Democratic leader, Franklin Roosevelt. As FDR had led his party out of the political wilderness and fashioned a political realignment for liberalism, so Barack Obama seemed destined to do the same for the Democrats of our day, that and even more. Now, in the latest stop on his modern political journey, Barack Obama has lit on his ultimate model, in the unlikely figure of the wealthy, stocky, and pugnacious Teddy Roosevelt. Not the Teddy Roosevelt of his earlier Rough Rider phase, leading from ahead the charge up San Juan Hill, nor the Teddy Roosevelt in his last phase as a champion of nationalist eugenics, but the Teddy Roosevelt of the middle period as the budding leader of the progressive, which of course is the label that Barack Obama and other Democrats on the left have chosen for themselves today. All of which brought Barack Obama to his roots in the small town of Osawatomie, answering his political dream by rediscovering its paternity in that very place, and the very place where Teddy Roosevelt had pronounced one of his most famous speeches. Obama's speech has been touted as the document that represents his program or vision for the nation today. It is the platform for the 1912 campaign. And what a difference in tone from 2008, when Obama preached unity, and slightly stretching Lincoln a bit, he spoke of a figure who called on a house divided on itself to stand together. It wasn't quite the Lincoln I remember. But now, in any case, with Teddy Roosevelt looking over his shoulder, Obama has made the line of division bright and clear, with malice towards the 1% and charity for the 99. Obama's theme deliberately echoes the message of the more confrontational Occupy Wall Street movement. And the effort of Obama's speech is to burnish that movement's recently tarnished reputation by, of all things, likening it to the democratic and populist spirit of the Tea Party, a movement that President Obama once disparaged and that the White House asked its minions in the press to vilify. Now the president, however, seeks to leverage the Tea Party's legitimacy to buoy up Occupy Wall Street. I guess we're all populists now. President Obama's speech in Osawatomie invites comparison with Teddy Roosevelt's address. Roosevelt's address, on a quick reading, I know you were all required to read it, so I did as well, it seems to me more compelling than President Obama's. It certainly, in Teddy Roosevelt's style, is more energetic. Giving the advantage in this judgment to Teddy Roosevelt, I suppose, is almost fixed in the cards. For who in this situation is copying whom? By coming to Osawatomie, Obama was paying homage to the originator, even as I'm sure that he hoped to be seen as outdoing him. I doubt in that case that he succeeded. And for good reason. Teddy Roosevelt had more time to prepare his address. He was perhaps the deeper thinker. And of course he had sought counsel from the likes of Herbert Crowley, as distinct from David Plouffe. But questions of style aside, Teddy Roosevelt defined what he thought was the central issue of his time, and he sought to address it. Historians tell us that the concentration of power and wealth was in fact the central issue of his time. Whatever President Obama is thinking, no one, of course, can know. But his Osawatomie address clearly evades the central issue of our time, and thus fails the test of real statesmanship. The central issue of our time, at least domestically, is the massive imbalance between what government now promises and the resources allocated to pay for these promises. Call it, if you will, the sovereign debt crisis. On this depends the fate of our national security, the soundness of our entire economic system, and justice for the generations to come. For every act of indebtedness is a tax on the next generation. Yes, therefore, one can speak of the justice. For the real crime taking place today is the redistribution of wealth to the majority of the current older generations at the expense of the wealth of the generations coming along. I sympathize somewhat with those young folks evicted from Zuccotti Park, but they have identified the wrong target. Whatever redistribution these crusaders clamor for from the 1% of the rich pales into insignificance in comparison to the massive and unjust distribution now going on among the generation. The sovereign debt crisis is a crisis not only of the United States, but of current liberal democracy as such under the welfare state model. It's almost universal, as events in Europe are making clear. Just think of how many progressives only 3 years ago were touting Europe and the European welfare state as the model for America. Now you never hear a progressive invoke Europe in a positive vein, unless it's to describe a lovely dinner enjoyed in Paris on some NGO's dime. And yet, in President Obama's blueprint for the future, the great challenge of our time barely makes an appearance, being mentioned in a couple of lines that tout of all things a paltry savings of $1 trillion, which is, of course, mostly fictitious anyhow. The debt crisis is not central to Obama's platform now. It was never central to him in the past, and it will not likely be central to him in the future. In fact, while Obama's Osawatomie speech was covered in the press mostly for its analysis of the issue of growing income inequality and diminishing economic mobility, the real news, as I see it in this speech, should have been something else. The speech is a call again for massive new domestic spending, for education, mostly higher education, for infrastructure, mostly high-speed train, and for technological research, mostly, I suppose, for solar and wind energy. If this new program is to be paid for, and I assume it would be, it will come from new revenues drawn from the upper 1%. But this program will do nothing at all to address the existing trends towards mounting deficit. We are broke, going broker, but we can at least take solace that we will pay for our next spending binge by new taxation. For this reason, it appears appropriate today to speak of the real division in this country as being that between the party of reality and the party of evasion. The party of reality faces the main crisis of our time, even if its different wings, some Democrats and some Republicans, differ on how to address it. The party of evasion minimizes or denies this crisis and, in a flight from reality, tilts at windmills. It keeps insisting on more spending and on creating more rights. It plays the old magical trick of focusing the audience's attention on things that do not count, leading them to ignore the things that really do matter. President Obama's Osawatomie speech is the platform for the party of evasion. I hope the 2012 election will present a clear choice between the party of reality and the party of evasion, but this still remains to be seen. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill, and Hudson for having me, and EJ for the kind introduction. And it's great to be on a panel with you all. I've enjoyed all of your work on the progressive era over the years. I'll try and be brief here so we can get to some interesting back and forth, I think, on some great ideas we've already heard. One of the things I want to focus on is how boring the election of 2012 is likely to be in comparison to the election of 1912. Now, maybe it's easy to do when you're reading history books and things like that, but what's most fascinating, and you get this in Sid's book, about the 1912 election was how much of a serious challenge there was to the two-party system. We haven't really talked about that. So you have this fight for the soul of the Republican Party between La Follette, Teddy Roosevelt, and Taft. It ends up being Taft. You have the creation of a new party, which has its own divisions that people don't acknowledge as much about the progressive era. You had a serious fight about issues of monopoly, regulation, the wisdom of an administrative state. Progressives are always being accused of supporting this big domineering state, but if you look at the origins of the progressive movement, there were real serious discrepancies in ideas about how these things would play out. Progressives were concerned about an overwhelming state undermining the sort of direct democracy that they wanted. You then had this fight between the new nationalism, the new freedom, and you actually had a socialist movement. I mean, you had, Debs scored quite well in 1912. You had all these constitutional fights about whether people would be the masters of their constitution or we continue in a tradition that basically put property rights above human rights. Basically, at the time, everybody's trying to figure out how to deal with the issues of industrialization. Compare that with today. The challenge to the two-party system is bubbling, but it's not anywhere near boiling. That's what I mean when I say 2012 is likely to be kind of boring. If we had a proportional system like Europe, the Democratic Party would likely break into three parts. You would have a populist left, environmentalists, probably intellectuals, people on the more activist side. That would be akin to something like the Green Movement would be my guess. You have the traditional African-American Latino labor base, and you have a centrist pro-business wing. That these things are now held together uncomfortably under the big umbrella of the Democratic Party. On the Republican side, my friends can talk more about this if I get this wrong, but you have an essential division between more traditional libertarians, social conservatives, and traditional business chamber types. These things are held together within a two-party system that hasn't been challenged the way it was challenged in 1912. Now, what do we have that is trying to challenge these? We have the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. And what's most interesting about these outside movements challenging the two-party system is that, in many ways, I'm not saying they're similar, they're arguing the same concern that the original La Follette progressives had, which is we are most concerned about the joining of federal power with corporate power. That was one of the big issues. If we're going to create a big national state that has administrative authority, how do we keep corporate interests out of it? Now, what happens is, this is talked about by the Tea Party more as crony capitalism. So you have a Tea Party argument saying we want to free the American people and the economy from the oppressive state that's a crony capitalist state. You have Occupy Wall Street and the folks down the street here in McPherson Square saying we want to free the people in our government from the corrosive influence of corporations and money. They're trying to challenge the two-party duopoly in some ways, but it's not likely to engage in any kind of refashioning of American politics that we saw in 1912. So that's why just a little bit of context about how reading about 1912 is probably infinitely more interesting than talking about 2012. That said, what about President Obama's speech is useful and interesting to talk about? I think it's pretty clear that he made a fairly shrewd move by embracing Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism here. I'm going to talk in a minute about how it doesn't reach the levels of TR's original address in many ways. But Obama has decided to run as a popular, incomplete steward of the middle class. His theme, which is actually not the new nationalism, it was Roosevelt's presidency, the square deal. He's going to be for fair play, a fair shot, and a fair share. These are pretty common themes in U.S. politics. The party that can embrace these typically does well. You certainly want to be on the side of the middle class and the side of fairness. I think, this fight over the payroll tax cut, the House Republicans are just stepping in the middle of this theme that he set up pretty cleanly. It's also obvious to me that he wasn't putting out a radical transformation of American politics. He's running against the Tea Party. He's essentially saying, and this is what's quite interesting about the new Osawatomie address, is how uncontroversial the agenda of Teddy Roosevelt is today. All the things that he basically outlined, there aren't too many people who will go against this. So the success of conservatism over the past 3 decades, I will say, was going after the excesses of post-war liberalism, not progressivism. They went after the big state that was doing too much, that spent too much money, that was interfering in people's lives. With the rise of the Tea Party and the House Republicans, and you heard this all over Fox News with Glenn Beck in the lead up to 2010, they were actually going after the progressive era. Now, if you read the actual agenda in the new nationalism, none of it's that controversial today. Conservatives like the initiative referendum recall process in some ways. They've used it well to limit the size of government. They use, as Sid mentioned, the administrative power of government to do a lot of things they want. The actual social and industrial justice agenda, most people aren't going to challenge the minimum wage. They're not going to challenge a lot of the social protections that were set up there. So I think Obama's quite wisely setting himself up as a defender of the most popular aspects of government against what he sees as a much more radical assault on the progressive era in some ways. So if it's Obama protecting a vision of government post-1910 and somebody defending it pre-1910, Obama's going to win that fight. And I think that's why he set it up this way. Now, as Mr. Rove outlined in his article today in the Wall Street Journal, Republicans aren't dumb, and they're not going to fall for this. They're not going to argue. I would imagine they won't, against the wisdom of Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism. They're going to argue about Obama's stewardship of the economy, and they're going to go after his agenda, whether it's on health care or stimulus or other things like that. The other thing that's interesting about the speech Obama gave is, as Sid also mentioned, there wasn't any big policy change in what he outlined. He has now taken his new foundation ideas, which is an investment in education, science and research, technology, energy, tax reform, financial regulation. He also talked about the wisdom of financial reform and stimulus at Georgetown in 2009. He's now taken that same agenda and put the rhetoric of fairness around it. He's taken the square deal rhetoric. That's how he's defending it. This is not a radical agenda. The biggest problem, I think, for Obama is not the charges of class warfare, which he will surely face. It's the bigger problem that people just tune out presidential rhetoric these days. It's not at all clear to me that people really care what the president says, whether he's a Democrat or Republican in any ways. It's very hard to communicate long-term the themes that are outlined in any of these speeches, and I think the rhetoric has to match actions, and it has to be seen as authentic. I'm not sure most Americans will be aware of some of the themes that were outlined in this speech. We'll see if he continues to push the fair play, fair shot, fair share, which, you know, sounds good on many different levels, will probably work, but I don't think it will define a whole new era of politics the way the new nationalism really did. So let me get some more differences between the two speeches. The most glaring one is that the crux of the new nationalism and all of the fights over the Constitution in the original progressive era was about the political reform agenda. I mean, the whole progressive movement was about political reform to establish social and industrial justice. That's what it was. There was the wedding of political and economic reforms. Obama is really, in his speech, trying to restore faith in the post-war order. And even more contemporaneously, 90s era prosperity. This isn't arguing for a whole new system of government in some ways, a whole radical rethinking of how we do things. He's trying to get back to the American dream of the post-war era and some of the prosperity of the Clinton era. There really is no fundamental challenge in Obama's address to the political order. There's no real talk about the reforms on the level that Teddy Roosevelt talked about. And there was really no concrete way to break this federal power, corporate power nexus that is animating both the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. The bigger challenge for progressives, and is to, you know, if we're going to have a new nationalism in some ways, is to also accept that times have changed very dramatically. As I said, the Teddy Roosevelt's address is fairly uncontroversial now. We're not trying to restore, we're trying to protect many of those things, but the biggest problem is that most of that has been accomplished. And we have this toxic distrust of government today, which is not unfounded. This is completely different than the days of Teddy Roosevelt in some ways. We didn't have the national state that we have now, and we didn't have all this toxic distrust of government. This is a big challenge for people who call themselves progressives and liberals that we have to take seriously. They agree with the architecture of the state that Teddy Roosevelt put out. What they don't like about the modern state is, one, it's corrupt, and two, it's potentially incompetent. These two things reduce people's faith and trust in government, and I think this is a long-term challenge for progressives that just recalling or protecting the great ideas in the new nationalism won't achieve. The second biggest one is the economic context, and I think both conservatives and progressives suffer from an inability to sort of see or put forth a number of solutions to deal with the globalized economy. So we either get a perception of more government or more markets, which the American people at this point, they don't buy either one of those arguments completely. It's fairly obvious that you're not going to have complete sort of libertarian laissez-faire. You're not going to have a very strong central state. Americans are distrustful of both of those methods in some ways. And most of the problems that we're now facing, particularly on the economy, transcend our own capacity to address them in our own national borders. And so, something that would address the economic conditions of today would have to be looking towards more global solutions in some ways. And that didn't come into play at all here. But I think ultimately, this was a fantastic address to rally Obama's base in many ways. I think he did that. He's wrapped up his policy in fairness and the bipartisan, at one point, belief in progressive ideas. But the idea of a new nationalism, or what's next, I think is a long way off. And I don't think this address that Obama gave was in any way intended to do that. I think that's the work of social reformers on the left to actually convince people that either stronger government action can enhance their own life opportunities, produce national prosperity, protect individual freedom, or it can't. And I don't think we've made that case yet. We're working on it. In the meantime, if the other side wants to have a fight about the wisdom of the progressive era, President Obama, who's a pretty cautious guy, is willing to take that on, and my guess is he'll probably succeed. So I enjoy hearing all your thoughts and look forward to getting some questions, and thanks again to Bill.
Thank you all. Thank you all, my panelists. It's a great panel. some of my best progressive friends, especially.
That's a severe qualifier.
It's a small group.
Which is I say my friends though because it's not that we agree on everything, but I respect people who take ideas seriously. And this is a discussion about the ideas of American political thought, or the promise of American life, as Herbert Crowley liked to put it. The fact that the Center for American Progress and the Heritage Foundation are both doing a series of papers about the meaning of progressivism in 1912, and the debate between people like Root and Lodge and the progressives tells you something about why these questions are important. Which is, in the end, American politics is less about policy debates and more about America. And that's why at every turning point election, every watershed, every realignment in American history, it always comes back to these questions about what America means. Think of 1800, 1860, 1936, to a lesser extent, even 1980. And so here we are again, making serious arguments about serious ideas. And another president has turned to American political history to frame his understanding of America and the campaign ahead. So where does he turn? Well, he began by invoking Lincoln. More recently, he's been campaigning as Harry Truman, running against the Do-Nothing Congress. You might think in hard times, I think as someone had mentioned, that he would go as a good Democrat and appeal to Franklin Roosevelt, who famously criticized the money changers in the temple and promised us the New Deal. And yet, in this significant economic speech, months in the making, the president takes a pilgrimage out to Osawatomie, Kansas. And believe me, no one goes to Osawatomie for no good reason. So there he gives what I think will be a defining speech of his administration, or as EJ says, the inaugural address Obama never gave, invoking the old bull moose. Now, I think this establishes that this president has given up on the center of American politics, and he's doubled down on the progressive model. And this tells us much about where he's coming from and where he is going. Now, let's think about this question posed by the progressives about 100 years ago. The original claim of the founders, the formalism the progressives revolted against, was that America was different, or in the context, the current way we talk about it, America is exceptional, because it's dedicated to universal natural rights. We're all fundamentally equal by nature, equally endowed with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This principle and the constitutional framework of law that enlivens it are the foundations of the American dream. The related principle that each has the right to the rewards of his own labor makes possible a dynamic social order in which every member of society can work hard, advance based on individual talent and ability. The primary obligation of government is to secure property rights, break down artificial barriers to opportunity, uphold the rule of law. This is sound economic theory. When property is protected, there is an incentive to work, to earn, to save, to invest. And when one is guaranteed to reap what you sow, more people will sow and more people will reap. When economic reward is available to all and the protection of property extends to all, the amount of wealth throughout society increases exponentially, and we can pursue our happiness. A basic safety net is provided by civil society and public assistance at the appropriate level of government. And that can now protect those who cannot take care of themselves. What's truly revolutionary about this model, I would call it the Madisonian model, is that the ladder of freedom and opportunities is available to everyone. As a result, poverty, not extinguished, has vastly diminished. Even more important, it is no longer a permanent condition from which there is no escape. Now, about 100 years ago, there arose what I would describe as a different dream, that government could better engineer how society operates. Progressive reformers were convinced that not only had the American founders been wrong about their assumptions about man, about human nature, the necessity of limited government, but also that advances in science would allow government to reshape society, eradicate those inequalities of property and wealth that had been unleashed by rights, democratic capitalism, and the resulting growth of commerce and business. A more activist government based on concepts of evolving rights, a living constitution, would redistribute wealth and level out those differences through taxation, economic regulation, extensive social welfare programs. The clearest formulation of this argument, of course, is from Herbert Crowley, Promise of American Life. He allows that Americans have an almost religious faith in their country, but quickly cuts to the chase. The traditional American confidence in individual freedom has resulted in a morally and socially undesirable distribution of wealth. The time has come to reject the ghosts of the founding and devote ourselves to a dominant and constructive national purpose, centered on a new theory of the state, in which experts administer government and regulate the economy to achieve progressive outcomes. By becoming responsible for the subordination of the individual to that purpose, Crowley writes, the American state will in effect be making itself responsible for a morally and socially desirable distribution of wealth. So, when Teddy Roosevelt is looking for a new and more comprehensive progressive philosophy, he finds it in Crowley's book, somewhere out in the safaris of Africa when he's reading it and gobbling it up. The material progress and prosperity of a nation are desirable chiefly so far as they lead to the moral and material welfare of all good citizens, Roosevelt observed in his Osawatomie speech. The initial draft was contributed, if not written by Crowley himself. Progress and welfare require not only the centralization of government, but also the nationalization of politics, a break from the American tradition of limited constitutional government. The federal government should now play an interventionist role to advance progressive democracy, real democracy, as he says, for if we do not have the right kind of law and the right kind of administration of the law, we cannot go forward as a nation. So in his own Osawatomie speech, President Obama dons TR's progressive mantle. Not nowhere near as high-minded as TR in the first place, I agree with the panelists, but he does it nonetheless. He does allude at the beginning to it in America where hard work pays off, responsibility is rewarded, anyone could make it if they tried. But that was the argument of his parents in earlier generations. This basic bargain has become so eroded by the marketplace that the defining issue of our time, he says, is to restore growth and prosperity, balance, and fairness. There's that word. The choice we face, as he frames it, is that offered by the progressives 100 years ago, at least that aspect of progressive economic choice. Between the harshness of market capitalism, which he defines in true straw man fashion as you're on your own economics with a free license to take whatever you want from whoever you can, social Darwinism, on the one hand, and the benign fairness of progressive nationalism, the view that we are greater together when everyone engages in fair play. Everyone gets a fair shot, everyone does their fair share. The word fair occurs throughout the speech, not opportunity, with reminders throughout that things must be made fair, and that means government. As a nation, we've always come together, he says at one point, through our government, through progressive fashion. So he returns to his old mantra, not a bold and new initiative, but his old mantra of federal education programs, infrastructure, economic regulation. And of course, raising taxes on the wealthy is the way to pay for those investments, and that's only fair. Now, he denies the charge of class warfare, of course, and his class warfare is conventionally defined. He's correct. What he's actually doing, however, is abandoning the average middle-class voter and its middle-class values, and hobbling together an alliance of state dependents, government hangers-ons, and political elites who claim the capacity to run things. His program is fundamentally about the rise of a new governing class that insists on arranging political and economic fairness. The managed quest for fairness, however, inevitably leads to bureaucratic favoritism, inequalities based on special interests, and undue political influence, the essence of what is called crony capitalism. Now, at some point in every presidential campaign, there's a speech that defines the candidate and provides the rationale for his policies in light of the larger meaning of the country. By turning to TR's new nationalism model, imperfect as it is, Obama has revealed that his intellectual antecedent actually goes back to the progressive model, calling his party back to its roots. The implication is to continue that progressive transformation of America through its various waves and phases over the 20th century. Let's call it now a fair society, as assuring not equal opportunity, but fair outcome. Those of us who take the arguments of American political thought seriously like to look at politics by way of analogy. In the Republican primary, for instance, we see Newt Gingrich challenging TR's disdain for predatory wealth, as well as his populist attack on the judiciary, wanting to abolish circuit courts call out marshals to round up judges who refused to testify before Congress. Just the kind of argument that brought Republicans to break with TR and that caused him to bolt his party and run as a progressive independent. And then, of course, there's Ron Paul, who's challenged the isolationist ghost of Midwest progressive Henry Wallace, which might explain why he's doing so well in Iowa. But these are mere amateurs. For President Obama, government fairness programs seem to be the central idea of his administration and his party. This is a risky strategy, it seems to me. For one thing, it's a hard sell to the American people. In a Gallup survey just a few days ago, respondents were asked to categorize 3 economic objectives: extremely important, very important, somewhat important, or not important. In the extremely very important category, grow and expand the economy, 82%. Increase equality of opportunity for people who to get ahead, 70%. Reduce the income and wealth gap between rich and poor, 46%. If anything, Americans have become more skeptical of government-centered solutions rather than less. And they're even less likely to embrace a new birth of progressive reformism that some, I think wrongly, thought they were endorsing in 2008. What's more, if this is President Obama's re-election template, it opens a wide space for the Republicans, admittedly usually inarticulate and as yet ununified, to make the broader case for economic opportunity and the reforms that better the conditions of the American people and solve the real problems we face, as opposed to the tired state-centric policies that try to make everything equal, but end up lowering everyone's horizons and drawing us ever more to national debt and bankruptcy. That case, the argument for opportunity, is already being made by folks like Paul Ryan, witness his anti-progressive speech at Heritage just a few weeks ago, and more recently, just this week, in Mitt Romney's new stump speech unveiled on Tuesday. So here we are. The 2012 election has become a referendum on the meaning of America, its exceptional promises and the engines of the American dream. That's a debate conservatives welcome, a debate this country needs to have, I think, and one that, if Osawatomie is the model, I think Barack Obama loses. Thanks.
Bill had kindly said that if I wanted to reply, I could, and I have been inspired, especially by Jim and Matt, to want to do that. I want to begin, though, by saying if anyone from Osawatomie, Kansas is watching, I apologize that we even seem to disagree on how to pronounce the name of your town. I want to salute Jim Caesar for doing such an excellent job on behalf of the Party of Evasion. Because the Party of Evasion claims that the biggest problem facing our nation is a budget deficit, whereas the Party of Reality understands that the biggest problem facing our nation is the growing concentration of wealth that has afflicted us for almost 40 years. The Party of Evasion tries to argue that, tries to protect the very wealthy by saying that elderly people who need health care in an increasingly expensive medical system are the source of our problems. The Party of Reality argues that the budget deficit has to be seen in the context of this economic inequality and the difficulties middle-class Americans are facing in a new world economy that has added literally 2 billion people to the global labor force. I could go on like this, and I'm perfectly happy to do so, but I think Jim underscored something that was actually very helpful for us, which is why did Barack Obama give this speech in Osawatomie, Kansas? And he gave this speech, I think, because he wanted to redefine what was the central issue in American life. And I think in the first 6 months of 2011, President Obama really went along with the narrative that Jim offered for the country and really seemed to accept that the fiscal problems facing the country were the most important. And it was a battle in which he did not do particularly well in public opinion. And I think he didn't do particularly well because I don't think that was ever at the center of Barack Obama's presidency. Solving our fiscal problems was a part of a larger objective. And so I think by giving that speech, President Obama really challenged the very definition of what is at the center of American politics. And therefore, I also disagree with Matt that this constitutes Obama abandoning the center. On the contrary, I think Obama has learned from a president very much admired at this institution, Ronald Reagan, which is you don't win by chasing the center, you win by moving the center and by persuading the center. And I think that what Obama was doing in invoking TR was trying to move the center and change the nature of our debate. A little of what I want to say comes from a book that I have coming out in May, in which my friend Bill Shambra actually plays a role. The book is called Our Divided Political Heart, and the subtitle is The Battle for the American Idea in an Age of Discontent. And I think the one thing all of us may agree on is that we are having a large argument over who we are as Americans. What does it mean to be American? What does our tradition mean? And in my book, I take issue with the Tea Party, but I salute them for encouraging us all to go back to our history. And that's the second reason why I think the Osawatomie speech was important. Jacob Javits, the senator, the progressive Republican senator from New York, wrote a very interesting book back in the 1960s called Order of Battle. And in that book, he has a section called A Choice of Ancestors. And he defends his brand of republicanism. And the ancestors he chooses are Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. And what I'd like to assert is, contrary to what some of my conservative friends would argue, the notion of a strong and influential federal government that was essential to American economic growth goes right back to the founding. The Constitution was not created to create a weaker central government. It was created to create a stronger central government because our founders understood that the situation of the Articles of Confederation, to which on some days I think Governor Perry wants us to return, was inadequate to the needs of a great nation. And I think that by going back to TR rather than FDR, President Obama was underscoring that there is a tradition of national action in our history, and it is the tradition that, on the whole, has served us better. What did TR talk about in the Osawatomie speech? Is it irrelevant to today? Well, he had a whole lot to say about the influence of corporate money on political campaigns. And if you go back and read what he said about that and look at the current situation we are in, it was indeed highly relevant. He also talked a lot about, and as Sid makes clear in his book, made it a central element of his campaign, he talked about overreaching activist conservative courts. And I believe, as for example, the Citizens United decision might suggest, that too is a central issue in American life today. He talked about concentrated economic power. There are sections of this speech that would go down very well if done through the human microphone of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And he spoke of the fears of the middle class that they were being squeezed out of both economic and political life. Yes, I believe Osawatomie is relevant to our moment. Now, in many ways, it's true that President Obama's speech is actually less radical than FDR's, than Theodore Roosevelt's speech was, though there is this wonderful moment in the Osawatomie speech where TR talks about his being accused of being socialist, and that a socialist paper in Kansas took this as a great insult to socialism. And I think that President Obama probably smiled when he read that part of the Osawatomie speech. We could probably discuss this, as many of you know. There is a great argument